Alice in Wonderland isn't about drugs. Now, I know that may come as a surprise to some people. It's pretty standard internet fare to point at Alice with all the trippy visuals and the mushrooms and the hookah caterpillar and declare that it was really all about drugs this whole time. Oh ho ho, and Disney made a movie about it. But it's not. It's not about drugs. I want to talk about Alice's adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass a little bit today, what they're really about, where this idea of them being about drugs came from, and why I find it to kind of be bullshit. So, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is an 1865 novel written by English novelist Charles Lutwidge Dodgson under the pseudonym Lewis Carroll. The sequel, Through the Looking Glass, was published in 1871. I'm going to focus mainly on these two original books and not the dozens and dozens and dozens of adaptations and remakes that exist. For the record, both books are in the public domain, so it's very easy to find PDF copies of them on the internet. Almost every movie version of Alice, including the Disney one, splices together elements and plot points from both of the books, rather than simply adapting one story or the other. It's not particularly important to know which characters and events happen in each, since they are very often published as a pair anyway, but we're going to have a quick overview. In Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Alice is a young girl who is in the garden of her home playing with her cat Dinah when she sees a white rabbit in a waistcoat run past, apparently late to an appointment. She follows the rabbit down the rabbit hole and thus into Wonderland. What follows is a quintessential example of literary nonsense, filled with wordplay, puns, and absurdity as Alice works her way through Wonderland. She eats an odd bite of cake and drinks a potion which changes her size. She cries so hard she creates a C. She recites some poetry she had to memorize for school, but gets it all wrong. She meets a mouse that won't answer her call in English, so she tries talking to it in French. She wonders if this assumed French mouse came over with William the Conqueror, because Alice doesn't know much about when things in history happened. They reach the shore where other animals are. The mouse then gives a lecture on William the Conqueror, and the animals agree to a caucus race to dry off, because Alice doesn't know what a caucus actually is. Alice meets the caterpillar, who seems to speak in riddles, correcting her grammar and not making sense. She meets the Duchess, who yells a lot and seems to ignore her baby. She meets the Cheshire Cat, who again doesn't make a lot of sense. And then the Mad Hatter and March Hare. More and more riddles. She plays a very silly game of croquet with the Queen of Hearts, where the rules don't make sense and the Queen cheats a lot. She meets a mock turtle, a pun on mock turtle soup. Apparently Alice thought mock turtles were an animal. Then the world's silliest court scene where everything is unfair and doesn't make sense, and then Alice goes back home, waking up as if from a dream. Set presumably about half a year later, in Through the Looking Glass, Alice is playing inside the house with two cats, Dinah's kittens, when she contemplates the mirror in the room. She finds that she's able to walk through the mirror and back into Wonderland. She discovers a mostly nonsense poem, Jabberwocky, which can only be read if you hold it up to a mirror. She also finds that the chess pieces in the room have come to life. What follows is another adventure in mostly absurdity, though if you know how, you can actually use Looking Glass as a step-by-step guide for a real chess game. Alice plays the part of one of the white pawns. She wanders through the garden of living flowers, meets Tweedledee and Tweedledum, talks to Humpty Dumpty, and eventually makes it all the way across the board and becomes a queen herself. The red and white queens throw her a party and then confuse her with riddles and wordplay. This actually results in Alice physically confronting the Red Queen and capturing her, putting the Red King into checkmate unintentionally, and thus she wakes up in her armchair back home, having won the game. Quick recommendation, if you want to get all of the little wordplay and puns and references in Alice and Looking Glass, I recommend The Annotated Alice by Martin Gardner. It's awesome. These books are pretty strange, so if not a psychedelic reflection about a weird acid trip or whatever, what's up with these books? Why are they so weird? Well, CARROLL said he wrote the book after he and a friend spent a day on a river trip with the three young daughters of Henry Liddell in 1862. During their journey, CARROLL entertained the girls with a made-up nonsense story about a girl named Alice. Alice Liddell was so entranced that she told CARROLL he should publish it. And so he did. He spent a few years refining the story before it was finally published, and the real Alice got her copy. So, on the surface, it's just that, a silly story meant to amuse children, a celebration of imagination and childhood silliness. But there are some underlying themes in these books. The encounters Alice have a sort of pattern to them. Adults in the books, whether they are the Queen of Hearts, or the White Queen, the Duchess, or the Hatter, often speak in riddles. They make up rules that don't make sense and refuse to explain them. The White Rabbit is obsessed with never being late, and much of the wordplay or silliness comes from Alice not understanding adult or unfamiliar concepts, like the mock turtle or a caucus race. And so, the books become a very silly exploration of how a child, viewing the adult world, might feel confused and lost. Wonderland is adulthood, cloaked in familiar childhood clothes. Nursery rhymes and game board pieces doing a fumbling pantomime of adulthood, discussing mathematical concepts and Latin grammar through the eyes of a child who doesn't understand it. There are many things that can be pulled from Alice. Ideas of innocence, of escapism, of identity and sense of self, of intentionally bucking order in favor of disorder. But none of those things are drugs. Side note, there is a whole other issue about CARROLL's relationship with the Liddell daughters and his fondness for young girls in general. This is a whole separate debate, and it gets kind of messy with contemporary views of childhood and adulthood, and whether there was anything untoward about his fondness for them, but that's really not what we're talking about today. So, why do people think this is a story about drugs? CARROLL wasn't known for opium use or even heavy drinking. He had no exposure to psychedelics. Magic mushrooms wouldn't be discovered by Europeans until 1955. So, why? I think the easiest answer is that people want stories to make sense. I want stories to make sense. I spent a lot of money going to college to get a degree in making stories make sense. We want there to be a reason that things happen in stories, and so when a story feels as random and silly and surreal as Alice, we want to figure out what it's really about. And this is kind of the underlying idea behind surrealism in general, creating art and meaning out of the absurd and random images of dreams and unreality. Side note, there is an edition of Alice with illustrations by Salvador Dali, which is amazing. And thanks to the culture of the 1960s and 1970s, there is a heavy association between reality-bending images and drug use, especially hallucinogens. And depending on which adaptation you are looking at, some movies really play up this trippy psychedelic aesthetic for Alice. But I think there's another level to this one, and one that I find much more grating. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is a story for children, especially for girls, and there is a certain segment of the population, especially among young adults on the internet, who really seem to enjoy taking things aimed at children and declaring, no, this thing isn't for kids, it's actually for me, and slapping a dark, edgy interpretation on top of it, however sloppily. Fan theories like, Ash is in a coma all along, or all the Rugrats are dead and Angelica is just imagining them, And yeah, a huge slice of the brony fandom declaring that adult men are the real audience. They aim at appropriating and co-opting child media for adult consumption. And there's something about that which leaves a sour taste in my mouth overall. I don't think there's anything inherently bad about reimagining child stories in more adult ways. But I do think it somewhat misses the point when people begin to insist that these mature reimaginings are the correct or more valid interpretation, especially if they lead to the exclusion of children from that media space. With Alice in particular, I think the story gives adult readers a chance to empathize with children, not as dolls or objects of cuteness, but as people interacting with a confusing and strange world as they grow up. It is an opportunity to revisit childhood with all its familiar characters and uncertainty and wonder, and rather than corrupt that story, I think it should be embraced. I'm going to leave you with the end of Alice's adventures in Wonderland. Alice's adult sister, having heard her story, lays back and herself begins to dream of Wonderland and of her sister Alice. And this is what it says. Lastly, she pictured to herself how this same little sister of hers would, in the aftertime, be herself a grown woman, and how she would keep through all her riper years the simple and loving heart of her childhood, and how she would gather about her other little children, and make their eyes bright and eager with many a strange tale, perhaps even with the dream of Wonderland of long ago, and how she would feel their simple sorrows, and find a pleasure in all their simple joys, remembering her own child life and the happy summer days. And that is what Wonderland is all about. Thanks for watching this video. I'll see y'all down in the comments, so if you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions, head on over. And if you enjoyed listening to this queer millennial feminist with a BA in English ramble on for a while, feel free to subscribe.